You're listening to Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right, well, hello, everybody. I'm Eric Vansel. Uh-oh. Did we lose you? Wait. Are you there now?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. All right. Well, introduce yourself, because we are live.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
Oh, yeah, it's chunking out for some reason. All right, well, hopefully we get through this one. So we're talking about 10 secrets that Palpatine revealed, or not Palpatine himself, but have been revealed about Palpatine's resurrection. Now, a lot of this is because of the fact that Screenrant put this, they basically put this list together. And it's interesting because this has to be based on the Bad Batch season premiere episodes, I would think. All right. So apparently you're frozen. All right. Well, we'll just leave your picture in there. So that way when you get back with us, it'll be okay. I'll just carry this one. So we're going to talk about some of the things that were revealed through the Bad Batch and these episodes that basically premiered. And hopefully Daryl can get his feedback, so that way it's an actual discussion. But again, you guys are free to chat in. We're going to pretty much roll this list out, get it started. And again, if you haven't seen the Bad Batch episodes 1 through 3, a lot of this, I think, is going to be a little bit interesting. Because if you haven't seen it, you might be lost. Because, like I said, a lot of this stuff came from that. So let me just, let me just roll into this. All right. So the first thing, at number 10, we learned a little bit about Project Necromancer. Now, the interesting thing about this is the fact that we first heard about this, and if you guys watched the show Friday when we did the review of episodes 1 through 3, you'll basically notice that I'd pretty much said, one of the things that I really want to see next, within the next few episodes, is, are we going to have a little bit more revealed about this? And so now you have the article still pulled up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, what were they talking about with this thing? Because if you remember, I actually talked about this, like I said, on Friday's show, where I was like, okay, well, we never heard of this before. You know, they had referenced Project Stardust, but, you know, what happened with this? And the other thing that I can say is, I'm going to go ahead, while you say it, I'm going to pull this up, because I have a feeling that maybe you having that open might be taxing the internet or something on your end, because you're still being a little bit choppy. So you gotta love live, everybody. We could pre-record this stuff, but, you know, we're gluttons for punishment. We keep doing this live, so yeah. I'm going to go ahead and try to call this up, and then I'm going to want you to close it, because you're just freezing up and it's being lost. So you're still there, right?
Yeah, I'm still here. I can hear you.
What's the matter? You can't see me?
No, I can see you. It's me, but trying to make some adjustments here to see if that helps.
Yeah, well, I always hated when. It's so funny how this still happens, like during the tests. You know, I could basically see the people basically leaving. Like, really, guys? But, you know, sometimes this happens. I mean, I think what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to start signing a lot earlier to really test some of this stuff. 'Cause this happens to us more often than not now. Let's see. Top 10 secrets revealed.
Okay. Um, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So essentially, Project Necromancer was Palpatine's big project. That's his big plan, and it basically refers to the raising of the dead to influence the future. So when we're watching the first couple of episodes, and when we get to the episode, well, basically chapter 23, um, there's a on in Mandalorian, Hux is working on a clone project. And so this is what this is referencing. This whole Project Necromancer is really something that Brendel Hux started, and then now but we're seeing this originally began way back during the Bad Batch era, where Hemlock is basically trying to replicate um, or basically start the process of being able to almost like replicate not just anyone, but a force user. And that's why this is so important to Palpatine, is because it's not just about um, just bringing someone back from the dead, but they need to need to be able to come back with a certain amount of force ability, or that's why the M count is so important.
Right. And I mean, basically, and again, Brendel Hux is the Hux we all know. Armitage, I think, is his first name, technically, from like The Force Awakens, Donald Gleason's Hux. Brendel Hux was actually his father, and he's honestly first introduced actually in the Aftermath trilogy. That's where we really first, and specifically in Empire's End. Empire's End is where we first start to read about him. I don't remember if he was in Life Debt or not. I know he appeared somewhere in that trilogy, and that was when they were starting to give a little bit of a hint of the creation of the First Order. And yeah, so right, he was basically working on this, and they offered a little bit of it in The Mandalorian, and now we're going back in the Bad Batch, and we're seeing more of this. So the question is, though, how much do you think this is going to be filled in the Bad Batch?
Well, I think the Bad Batch is really the setup, and honestly, and also I'm glad you brought this up, Eric, because this is something I almost really want to kind of explore with everyone. Is that I think this is a great sandbox to somewhat play in. No pun intended. That a lot of things happen on sand planets like Tatooine and Jakku, but
right.
I think that this could serve as the backdrop or the platform for covering things post Mandalorian era. So when the Mandalorian season series comes to an end, I think this sets up a lot of things because Grogu factors into all this, and we'll get to him a little bit later. But Grogu factors into this as well, and we need to talk about this whole cloning, this whole Palpatine plan, because Necromancer kind of expands all throughout the original trilogy and even into the sequel, leading up through the sequel trilogy, as we saw. Because Palpatine is pretty much obsessed with cheating death. That's one of his big things, as he learned from Plagueis, his master. So he's basically trying to finish what Plagueis kind of already started and finding out a ways around it. And there's references to during the original trilogy when Vader finds out about some things and Vader tries to call Palpatine out on stuff and Palpatine has to put him in his place. I mean, this is really a interesting, a very interesting storyline that kind of has run its thread, in the undercurrent all throughout since the prequels, the original trilogy with the post prequel era, Mandalorian and not Mandalorian, but Bad Batch, Rebels, all that, all the way through the original trilogy up to the sequel trilogy. There's just been this constant flow of things that Palpatine has kind of had in the backdrop all along that we never really knew. And now this stuff has come to fruition now. So I think this is kind of a cool thing if you really want to stay in the original era, I guess, if you will, of Star Wars. When you're dealing with the typical characters that we're used to, coming in contact with. So this whole thing, Necromancer, as we're seeing in Bad Batch, is basically Palpatine's little science fair project of trying to figure out how to cheat death. And he's like, okay, I did the cloning thing, and that was the whole purpose. His test was the whole clone army. That was the first test of it all. And then so he's like, okay, cool. I can clone people, and that was one of those things that if you really stop and think about it, now it all starting to make sense now. Because the clones were like, all right, I need someone who has a high level of ability, Jango Fett, who's a fantastic marksman, who's a great hunter. He's strong, he's smart, he's cunning, has all these different abilities. Jango serves as the host for the whole clone army. So Palpatine's like, cool, I have this army that's basically a super soldier, almost like a Captain America, if you will. I have this super army now. And the great thing about them is like, okay, I can accelerate their growth. So not only am I just creating them, but I'm aging them to the appropriate age where I need them to be to do the task that I need them to do. And then on top of that, all right, they're completely obedient. I have this whole chip that I can implant in them from their time they were embryos that makes them totally subservient. And so Palpatine is pushing the envelope. And so once he realizes that, like, okay, wow, I have this huge, great army now. This is awesome. But as we're starting to see in Bad Batch, and it's being explored now, there's some degradation that's just taking place. And now those clones are no longer as subservient as they once were. They are starting to kind of exist outside of the matrix, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's a problem for Palpatine. So now it's like, okay, well, that's where the whole, let's just wipe them out and bring in the whole stormtrooper thing, where now that's based, instead of just based upon putting chips in people's, brains, I'm just going to use the power of manipulation, because the Empire's been in power for so long that now I can just manipulate everyday people to want to just serve me. So that's the whole Stormtrooper program. However, Palpatine still has in the back of his mind, like, okay, I did it once, I can do it again, but I need to be able to preserve myself, because like you said, Eric, on the last show, he realized that the dark side, although it makes him super powerful, it also, the exchange is that it gives away for his life.
Yeah, well, and I mean, look, there's all of that, because one of the things that was really interesting to me about this whole thing was I first thought when he mentioned Necromancer in the Bad Batch episodes that it's, this must be like that undead zombie stormtrooper thing that we saw in the Ahsoka series with Thrawn.
Mm-hmm.
That's at first what I thought it was, that maybe that was a failed experiment to create, and it all ties in actually, because first Palpatine learned to basically make clones of himself or whatever, but remember, the Sith troopers, that was really what that was supposed to be about, was you'd had a bunch of like force-using stormtroopers at this point. Now, unfortunately, in true, Disney Star Wars fashion, what ended up happening was in The Rise of Skywalker, they created these super cool troopers, and I think we got a little bit of performance out of them. They were mostly there to look cool. Ted Adam Green was basically saying that I could see and hear both of you fine, so that's good, because
awesome.
Like I said, I think a lot of times what happens is on our computers, the internet will sort of chunk out on us, but it's actually streaming perfectly fine, so everybody's like, what are they talking about? And then, of course, we have a Twitch viewer. Vesk was like, hey, what's up? So what's up? We're always glad to see people joining us on Twitch, because, again, we stream on Twitch. We have a few people that are watching us, but it's always nice when people on Twitch chat in. So, look, we can get comments from YouTube or Twitch. So whatever platform you guys are watching this on, go ahead and chat in. Let's, be part of the discussion. All right. So the next one, number 9, and again, I got to stress this. This is Screen Rant's list. Now, this isn't like a top 10 type of a thing or anything like that. This is just, look, these are 10 secrets that have been revealed about Palpatine's experiments and his resurrection and all this other stuff. So we're going through this list. All right, so at number 9, we basically had the cloning experiments beginning on Mount Tantus. And this is important because this is also in alignment with the expanded universe. The expanded universe had this point too. And I personally was really happy to see that they're starting to align a little bit some of the origin stories that we saw in the expanded universe, bring them into official canon, so that way we get a little bit of consistency. Because one of the problems we've always had, of course, is that there's a lot of us who love the expanded universe and the stories. And there's still quite a bit of it that they could bring into canon without necessarily changing anything. There's other things they could bring into canon where, they might have to alter things a little bit. Like, say, Mara Jade, right? You could still have her have that whole relationship with Luke Skywalker. Like, the whole first part of it can exist. It just, now it has more of an expiration date. It's like Luke has to be single and grumpy by this point. So something has to happen. But they could still bring her in, though, and maintain that same storyline. So I was really happy to see that this happened. And of course, this is something that was revealed. Actually, this was revealed at the end of season 2, wasn't it?
Of
Clone or Bad Batch.
The Mount Tantus?
Yeah.
Yeah, we started to see that's where Tech eventually, died. Yeah.
Right. Because they were trying to, and then of course in the beginning of this season,
Hunter
that's when we see, they were trying to do that whole thing, but then we also see, remember those, it started out with the troopers and then they crash landed right outside the perimeter or whatever. So now, and of course that's where Omega is, that's where Nala Se is, and Hemlock and all those guys. So it was really nice to see that align a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the Palpatine, it basically says Palpatine moved his cloning experiments to Exegol by the time of the original trilogy. But the Bad Batch reveals that they began at Mount Tantus. Palpatine also kept his cloning facility at Mount Tantus Legends time, and eventually discovered by Grand Admiral Thrawn in the Star Wars Empire by Timothy Zahn. Having Palpatine trying to create a clone immediately after Clone Wars clarified dark science and cloning were secrets only the Sith knew in The Rise of Skywalker, as Hemlock proposed the technology for Project Necromancer following Kamino's action.
Yeah, so this is basically, like you basically said in the last point, this is more, look, this is how it all began. And I agree with you that they could probably mine now, once they set all this up, they can then begin to mine, look, this is what's going to happen after, say, The Mandalorian, right? Because it's really in between the time period of, say, Mandalorian and Ahsoka all the way up to Force Awakens. That's the period that they can really start to play with a little bit. But they have to be careful, because whatever you establish, now it becomes canonical, and it would be a lot harder to undo, which of course is the sequel trilogy's problem. But I do like the fact that they're really starting to play with this time period between immediately after Return of the Jedi and, say, up into The Mandalorian. That's a really key piece, and to me, that's really probably the most interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and just, I like how they are finding ways to, because we talked about this initially from when we found out that Palpatine was coming back in The Rise of Skywalker, right? When we first heard that trailer and that cackle, we was like, are they bringing Palpatine back? How?
Yeah, that's right.
And it's just like, okay, so then now we're trying to find answers to all this, because, like, okay, now we have to figure out about Snoke, and he's like, oh, I created Snoke, and and all this stuff, and it was really kind of confusing because they were bringing up a bunch of stuff without any exposition.
Mm-hmm.
As to and because that we know in, in the real world, that they really didn't have a plan per se when they were making these films. It's only now that the films are out that they're finding, might I add, creative ways of explaining this stuff in a way that it's like, okay, now it's going to make the sequel trilogy make a little bit more sense now. And I'm okay with that, because at least they gave themselves an out. They have 30 years between the events of Return of the Jedi to about the beginning of Force Awakens. You got 30 years that you can play with, which a lot of things can happen in that time period. So I think that with Mount Tantus, I like the fact that they're bringing in, like you said, Eric, the expanding universe. We're bringing in Thrawn. Thrawn knew about all this,
Right.
and we're going to get to him a little bit later in this conversation. And, just putting a lot of the, peeling back the layers and putting a lot of pieces on the shelves where it belongs to get the full picture of kind of what's going on here. So I was really excited about all this.
Yeah, well, that's basically it, right? I mean, besides having this really rich time period that they can play with, it's one of those things where they have to balance doing it correctly, obviously, with giving us a bunch of extra content and extra things. I would almost rather see them maybe brush the edges and then fill in the gaps with the books and the comics, because if you mess up a book or a comic, that's easier to come back from than if you're putting stuff out there in a film or, a TV series or something. You can always go like, all right, we'll just sort of make this out of print now and let it go away. And I mean, half the time, the only people that are really reading this stuff are the people that are super interested in it. And being that they're the most hardcore fans, they're going to forgive any little missteps. But yeah, that's important. So it was nice to see. All right, so at number 8, we basically have the whole idea of why cloning was so difficult. And obviously, we talked about this a little bit, where it was one thing to clone basically a bounty hunter, right? But now you're trying to clone a Force user. And so now you have to have midichlorians present in order to do this. The midichlorian count has to probably be relatively high. Definitely has to be pure. Of course, we talked about this in Friday's review of the first 3 episodes of The Bad Batch, where we were speculating, well, we don't really know if it's a high count or if it's a pure count or maybe a balance of both. We're not really sure yet. Obviously, more has to be revealed, but it was nice that they're bringing this up. And it's nice that they're actually starting to fill in gaps of things that even when Lucas had it. Because if you remember, the midichlorian thing just came out of nowhere. It was sort of like, well, I mean, okay, now we're sci-fi. It was weird, because in all of Star Wars, we never had that. I mean, at least they didn't bring that up in Revenge of the Sith. I mean, okay, in their defense, the first movie of the prequels, but still, we had, a good 20 years almost, to live with those original trilogy films. So all of a sudden, you had this weird concept. It's like, all right. So what does it say about this whole thing?
Well, and before I even get into that, I think we'll have to, maybe into some degree, maybe I'm just super fanning out on this or whatever, but in a way, I think you also have to kind of look at the purpose of the films at the time. So when we talk about, we didn't have that in the original trilogy, to which I agree. I think that wasn't so much the focus, because at the time we have the big thing was like, okay, the threat of this empire trying, like, that was the main focus of it all, and we have to kind of stop this. And this kid is basically the only hope we have so we need to get him ready to tackle this task. I think when we go to the prequel trilogy, I think that's where, because that's the whole idea of a prequel, is to really explain how a lot of this stuff kind of happens. And so I think Lucas probably figured that was a better place to start with the midichlorians, and that's why he chose episode 1, because now you can start to explain it a little bit more, which he really didn't do as much as you got into Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. But at least it was kind of put out there where it's like, okay, yes, the Jedi can use the Force as well as Sith, but it's based upon this concept. And, you know, and I think maybe later on down the line, this it allowed room for somebody like Filoni and Favreau to now expound, just take that one little piece and make that into its own story. And I think that's what's happening right now, is that George kind of laid out a landscape, and in that landscape, he's put little pieces there that if you want to, you can make a host almost like a spinoff of just midichlorians and what that's all about. You can almost do a science fiction, or you can stay in like this lane here and do that. So that's just my thoughts on it. Maybe I'm super fanning out.
Yeah, now before you get into it, just to piggyback off of that one now, there is a degree of argument that you can make that says, okay, look, in the original trilogy, he was just trying to give us the broad strokes of what the Force is. Mm-hmm. Because that's what we needed to understand for that particular story. Now you could go back, because you have to deal more with the Jedi. Because remember, in the original trilogy, the Jedi were non-existent, basically. Well, now that you're going to go back and say, okay, there's all kinds of them running around here now. So now we can get a little bit more into the why and the how. Mm-hmm. And so, sure. Because I remember we did that whole show on midichlorians, remember? It was actually one of our most watched shows. And we actually were debating a little bit with each other, not much, but a lot with the audience. Yeah. Where, was this a good idea? That kind of thing. And so eventually the consensus became that, look, this is just like a measuring stick, basically, right? This is just, it doesn't really change the way the Jedi access the Force. It's just sort of like a barometer of how sensitive are they to accessing the Force. So obviously, the higher the count, the more sensitive you are. You may or may not be more powerful. I mean, I can imagine it's almost like having a high IQ, right? I mean, you can have a very high IQ, but you might not amount to much. Whereas somebody who has a lower IQ, who has to work harder, might then actually be super successful. So it's just sort of a barometer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so. Let me get back to. We need to get back to the article. Here we go. So, according to Hemlock, the key to making of clones is a successful M count replication, meaning they must be able to clone midichlorians. So Palpatine struggled to create a clone throughout the Star Wars timeline, and the Bad Batch finally explains why. Hemlock, as I just said, the key to making Force sensitive clones is a successful M count. The Phantom Menace, which we just referenced, they established these as microscopic organisms. These microscopic organisms were essential to connecting to the Force. So as a powerful Force user, Palpatine must have a high M count. It makes sense that Hemlock would struggle with M count replication, as artificially duplicating the Force would be unnatural. Mm-hmm. So that also kind of gives credence to what Palpatine said. When Palpatine made the statement in Revenge of the Sith, and he says, the dark side of the Force leads to abilities that some will be believes to be unnatural. And, now that gives more credence to that line, because, yeah, it's one thing to create, and it's one thing to create like an organism, right? Like you're taking a sample of, blood or tissue sample, and it's like, okay, you can recreate stuff like that. But it's very difficult to create energy, because energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It's just is what it is. And so I think that's where the problem comes in, because not only are you trying to, like, I'm sure when you duplicate a cell or a tissue, it's like, all right, yeah, you're creating, and it's, of course, that's going to have some degradation to that. But I think also to push something to a high limit like that um, would be very challenging without the proper conduit for it, if that makes sense. So I
Yeah, and I
think that's
mean,
the reason why that's why Palpatine is having such a hard time with this, is because he has such a high midi-chlorian count, much like Yoda, much like Anakin, um, much like a lot of like people probably like Mace Windu or something like that, like who are really powerful. And it's one thing to kind of replicate some skin cells or some, tissue samples, but like to create energy is a whole completely different thing, and that it has to be able to be sustained in a in an organism. And by the definition, like Eric, you said, about the force is it's an entity, it's a living entity as well. So that's why they always say be mindful of the living force, because it's constantly alive. And it chooses who it wants. So if it's not choosing to want to keep you alive, you see what I'm saying? Like now you're trying to you're trying to force the
well, we
force
don't
essentially.
know. The thing, I don't even know if it's so much like it's cloning energy as much as it is cloning the actual midi-chlorian organisms themselves, which of course are the gateway to the energy. I think that that's really more, if that's not what they're talking about, it's definitely more realistic, at least in its approach. But it's fantasy at the end of the day, so they can say whatever they want. Ted Adam Green has an interesting question. He says, was there the first mention of a Palpatine clone in the 1992 Dark Horse comic series Dark Empire, or did the EU have a mention earlier than that? It really depends, because Timothy Zahn definitely talked about it in his Thrawn trilogy. So Heir to the Empire was written in 1991. Dark Force Rising, I think, was like maybe it was either a year or 2 years later. I think Last Command came out a little while after that. I don't remember. It's funny because I remember when Heir to the Empire came out, but the other ones, I don't remember if it was just like the traditional 1 year in between or a few years, or, we'd have to figure that out. But that's definitely one of the earliest mentions. You had that Joris C'baoth guy who was the clone of that Jedi from years ago. But I do believe that Zahn had mentioned the Palpatine clone, or at least that he was trying to clone himself and actually had a bunch of unused clones. Because I seem to remember somewhere in that storyline where the rebels, well, they're actually the New Republic at that point, had basically found Palpatine's cloning facility. At that time, of course, it was still on Tantus, because remember, that was a invention of the EU. So they had found his cloning facility, and they had found a bunch of clones. And in fact, Luke ended up, even in the novels, I know he did it in the comics, but even in the novels, and I believe in that series, he actually fought Palpatine again as a clone. But as far as where it was mentioned first, they're probably right there. They're probably right there. I mean, that was right at the beginning. Because obviously that was one of the ways that you can bring him or keep him around, because, his death in Return of the Jedi was pretty definitive. So, there is that. But yeah, no, that's a good question. All right, so number 7. Number 7 actually goes into what we're talking about here. Number 7 is talking about how Omega is the key to Palpatine's cloning experiments. Because again, as we saw at the end of episode 3, was it at the end of episode 3 that, yeah, it was, that her blood finally came up on the wheel of platelets, or whatever you want to call it. Where her
destiny.
Yeah, exactly. Her blood was, it was its turn up the bat, so to speak, and then, all the really pretty yellow lights came on and was like, ooh, this is basically a pure specimen. So that's pretty obvious now. And honestly, See, this is not something that was really news to me. I mean, a lot of this other stuff was, but I was guessing this ever since the introduction of Omega. Because she
What?
was, like Nala say, she was really important to her, and they were sort of trying to protect her, and then she hooked up with the Bad Batch, and then it seemed like, okay, she was just going to be sort of that plucky, almost comic relief or something, kind of to give
Hmm.
that 3 men and a baby vibe to the Bad Batch, give them some paternal instincts or something like that. But then, when they made that big reveal that she was an unaltered clone like Boba Fett, then I started going, all right, I think there's more to her story now that we're going to find out in later seasons. And sure enough, I just hope they don't do the whole, force power thing and start to cheese out, you know.
Well, I won't. I can't necessarily disagree because explanation. So Hemlock's goal of um, the MCOM replication also explains why the Empire needs Omega, as she is the only one who's the only one who can survive an M-count transfer. Omega and the Bad Batch have unique genetic mutations that give them special abilities. Hunter's enhanced senses, Wrecker's incredible strength, and Crosshair's excellent marksmanship. Whatever the Kaminoans did when creating her, Omega is the only clone whose blood is compatible with midichlorians,
Mm.
meaning the Empire needs her alive. If Palpatine can replicate midichlorians, his best bet is to transfer them to a host. And so that makes a lot more sense to me because it's like, all right, we always were trying to figure out, like, okay, well, what's her ability? Because we knew she wasn't like the rest of the soldiers. Because first of all the soldiers were male.
Yeah,
So number one, how did you get a female out of that?
right. I
That's
mean,
the first
unless,
one.
was Django, did he have a secret life that maybe we didn't know about?
Well, and I think because of, um, and like I said, whatever the Kaminoans did, which obviously they tried some things like, okay, we see what we can do with men. Let's see if we can create a woman. And I think that's where things, and it's like, oh well, she can't be a part of the regular troops because she's not a man. So we have to kind of use her. Maybe we can use her more so in the laboratory sense. And I think that's why they have Dr. Carr, because she's a clone as well.
I was just about to ask that. I mean, and what's her
So
blood
I
work
think
like? Nobody really thought to, stick her blood in the wheel.
so I think, and I think there may be more that's going to be revealed about her as well. Because we've already seen that, like, okay, she's known to break protocol a little bit as well because she tried to save and help Omega.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be something to that.
Yeah,
But that
there
makes
could
a
be.
whole lot of sense though, because out of the that's why they're the Bad Batch, or Force 99, Clone Force 99, because they have these enhanced abilities.
Well, the funny thing
And
about that,
so
though, and
mhm.
this is the thing that trips me out, and actually, I give them a lot of respect for this because this was something that I thought was subtle, and I almost wonder if they didn't even do this on purpose. It just worked out that way, and maybe somebody noticed. But I really like the way that the Bad Batch, and I mean, pretty much there was a bunch of them, right? I mean, that just happens to be
Mhm.
Clone Force 99, but there were a bunch of people that were considered part of the Bad Batch. And it
Mhm.
was originally thought that they were rejects. It's like, well, they're not falling under the same protocol and the same parameters and all that the regs do, basically, right? So
Mhm.
they were considered rejected. But then along the lines, somebody's going, well, wait a second, there's something special about these guys. And Palpatine, of course, got wind of it somehow. And so now, what was once thought as rejected and, you're a misfit and all this other stuff, it's like, well, maybe not so much, right? Now they're the desired ones. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if they were just rejects and they had nothing to offer,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm sure they would probably have been terminated. But the fact of the matter, they have something to offer.
Well, they wanted to terminate him.
very
Remember the Clone Wars? Now, again,
yeah.
that original Clone Wars episode, which was season 5 or something, that was just called The Bad Batch. And it
Mhm.
wasn't those specific characters that we know of now, the Clone Force 99 ones. But they were trying to get rid of them. And then, of course, all through, now the Empire's trying to get rid of all clones, but
Right.
they sort of were trying to get rid of them periodically, basically.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm saying like they still were allowed to serve in certain capacities, and they will also sometimes just send them in as like, all right, we'll send Clone Force 99 in there. Let
Well,
them do it.
kind of by that time, sure. But remember that one Clone Wars episode, the big crux of the episode was they were making them like janitors and stuff. And that one particular group, which was what Clone Force 99 was based on, banded together and said, no, we want to go out there and fight or whatever. So they did that whole test or whatever, and then they purposely rigged it so they would fail, but they somehow overcame it. And, that probably, I would imagine, was the catalyst of them saying, all right, maybe we don't make them janitors. Maybe we, maybe we put them in and try to exploit their skills. Because remember, one of the big problems that they had with all of them was that they weren't conditioned to follow orders like the regs were. And that could be a problem in the battlefield. So, yeah. Well, here's one. The number 6 one should come as a surprise to absolutely no one. I mean, unless you just got into Star Wars yesterday. But Palpatine's cloning experiments are basically building off of Darth Plagueis' work, which anybody that's seen Revenge of the Sith and then following, because remember, this is all still expanded universe stuff that Lucas cherry-picked and basically put into the prequel trilogy, but now, I mean, it was implied in the sequel trilogy as well, especially when Palpatine reiterated the dark side of the Force leads to pathways some consider to be unnatural line, which I thought was cheesy, but,
Yeah, I mean, well, it basically says Hemlock's focus on midichlorians implies that Palpatine's cloning project is based on the work of his Sith master, Darth Plagueis. Palpatine used Plagueis' story to manipulate Anakin in Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, telling him that Plagueis could use the Force to influence the midichlorians to create life. The Legends novel Star Wars Darth Plagueis by James Luceno delved into Plagueis' experiments on other life forms to understand midichlorians, similar to Hemlock's work on Mount Tantus. Palpatine always sought his master's ability to cheat death, and the Bad Batch shows how their methods were.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, this is really more of a continuation. All that's happening is that Disney and Lucasfilm are taking some of these established concepts that both came partially from Lucas himself and was featured in the films, certainly in the Clone Wars, and then also borrowing heavily from things that were established in the expanded universe and aligning them to create this more cohesive origin story of how Palpatine started with all these experiments. And I mean, so far I'm fine with all this stuff. I actually applaud them, and you don't hear that too often. But I applaud them for, so far anyway. I mean, look, there's time for them to screw this up, but so far I think they're handling this correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I could totally agree. I mean, I think this is a great step for them, and if they do it right, that's the optimum phrase.
It's
If
always
they do
that
it
variable, right?
it could really, no pun intended, resurrect Star Wars to be what it should have been.
Yes, I absolutely agree. It would really put them in a really good spot, so they better not mess it up with the films. Although, In a lot of ways, the films seem to be unrelated, and that's another thing that I'm not so sure is a good idea, but that's a discussion for another time. All
Well,
right.
yeah, I agree, but maybe that Mando Grogu movie could start that path.
That could. If they do movies that are based in that Mandoverse, then you can
Hmm.
do it. But I don't know. I mean, the movies that are out right now, or I should say that are slated to be released soon, they do fill in some of the gaps, right? Like one's talking about how the Jedi began, and I mean,
Hmm.
I guess you could say that from a peripheral point of view, they're related. All right, so number five, we basically have, and I remember this comic, by the way, that Sith would consider the whole Necromancer project to be an abomination. And that was something that I remember from this comic where Palpatine was basically revealing, like, look, other Sith Lords would actually be horrified at what's going on. I mean, even with Plagueis, right? Plagueis was somewhat breaking ranks and doing this stuff because the Sith, this more or less violated the way that the Sith thought, because their whole thing too was that if you didn't understand, like if you didn't know how to keep power or whatever, you deserved to die. And, everybody had their time. And there's a lot of things in the Sith code that would really not be too popular if they actually were back and they actually saw this. Luckily for Palpatine, though, there's really no other, I mean, unless they want to have Exar Kun's spirit still floating around somewhere like they did in the expanded universe. But there's another Sith
Hmm.
Lord actually in this comic too that Vader ended up fighting. It was kind of an ancient guy. So they do pop up. A lot of times we talk about the Jedi that pop up out of nowhere, and we're like, where is this guy during the original trilogy? That happens on the Sith side too, by the way. Like, there's been some Sith Lords that have popped up, and you're like, okay, rule of
And
too
you are.
much. It's
Yeah, I mean, this one was cool because it says Palpatine warns Hemlock that many in their ranks would consider Project Necromancer an abomination, a subtle reference to Darth Vader in Star Wars Darth Vader comic number 5 by Kieran Gillen and Salvador Larroca. Um, Vader discovered that a scientist named Silo, or Kylo, depends on how you pronounce it, had created warriors with force-like abilities replicated by technology, something Vader finds blasphemous. He confronts Palpatine in the following issue and calls their creation heresy. And but Palpatine defends his actions by noting that Vader himself is alive because of technology. I would say, "Ooh, burn," but he's beyond that point already.
yeah. Yeah, hence why he's,
This, yeah, hence the
technology is there.
technology.
Yeah.
This implies that Vader and perhaps the Sith philosophy would disapprove of Palpatine's cloning experiments, and basically has this uh, the excerpt from the clip, I mean, from the comic, where Vader's like, they're abominations, and Palpatine kind of puts him in check. He said, "You forget who the master and who is the student. It is your duty to learn what I know. It is my duty to learn what there is to teach." I was like,
Yeah, which I
nice.
actually, that was a really cool
I
line
like that.
actually. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a nice line.
that was a nice line because that is also something, and hopefully we get more of these kind of insights in the Acolyte, which now, by the
Hmm.
way, just to put it
That's
out there,
official date.
has an official date of like June 5th, I think.
Yep.
And we should be seeing a trailer at some point soon. And of course, if we do, we'll probably react to it or at least talk about it here. But yeah, those are the kinds of things that I would like to see explored actually in a series like The Acolyte if it's going to be very Sith specific. Because
Hmm.
yeah, that was a brilliant line actually. And really, I don't know. I mean, that's, you could sort of generalize that into any master student or
Teacher,
yeah,
I
or
mean, teacher,
whatever.
student, coach, or
Yeah.
player, and
Yeah.
mentor, mentee type thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. All right, so Chad's got a question. He's like, Star Wars back in theaters May 3rd? It's the Phantom Menace that's in theaters, right? That's coming back.
Was it Phantom?
I think it is.
Yeah. I thought it was that or Return of the Jedi. Yeah, I know they've both been kind of talking about bringing them both back into theaters. I know Phantom Menace is supposed to be coming, but I also thought they were bringing Return of the Jedi back as well.
Well, maybe. Although I guess bookending the like Lucas's stuff, I don't know. That's a good
Yeah.
question. What to look at? I know the Phantom Menace is because I saw the tickets, and this is
Yeah.
the 25th anniversary. That's why they're doing it
hmm
for this year.
Man, it's crazy.
I
to think
know
that, like,
it's
man.
crazy to think about that. That it's actually been that long. I know.
It's
I'm
wild.
used to saying that for the actual original trilogy movies.
Original
Like,
trilogy.
oh, it's been 25 years since A New Hope or something stupid, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Chad goes, he's like, makes me feel young again. I don't know, man. It has the opposite for me. It makes me feel old. Maybe if I go and watch it. But then again, I wasn't all that young when the Phantom Menace came out. I was like 28, so.
Well, yeah, that's the crazy thing, because how you feel about the original trilogy is basically how I feel about the prequels, because the kids now are like, oh yeah, man, like this movie came out. I'm like, yeah, I was a freshman when that came out.
Right.
Like I was a freshman in high school when that movie was released, and like you said, you were 28. So, and this is after you already lived with the original trilogy since its inception. So,
well, you know what?
yeah,
That's why in our tagline it says 2 generations.
Yep. All things Star Wars.
2 generations, 2 fans, or is it 2 fans, 2 generations? I guess I should get our tagline straight, huh? All right. Well, anyway, moving on to number 4. So this goes along with it, and this is what I was actually alluding to even earlier, right? In the discussion when we were talking a little bit about Vader and his abilities and everything, and that is that Palpatine never really intended Vader to replace him. He was just like, you know what? Normally the student would somehow vanquish the master and then, take over. Palpatine's like,
Yeah, Palpatine always wanted the power for himself. The Bad Batch Darth Vader Easter egg also confirms that Palpatine never intended to be replaced. And Kieran Gillen's Darth Vader series revealed that Palpatine began looking for potential replacements after Vader nearly died on Mustafar. But even this was only a backup plan. Vader eventually proved a worthy apprentice, but Palpatine would never have allowed him to be struck down, violating the Sith rule of 2. In Star Wars Legends, Plagueis believed that the ritual of the apprentice killing the master would end with him. So Palpatine must have thought the same in canon.
yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, a lot of this stuff makes sense, right? Because it was like you said, what's actually happening is that they're taking a lot of these different concepts that have been introduced in either some comics, books, even some of the animated shows, and they're starting to really align this stuff. I mean, it began when Disney, of course, declared that everything was canon. It's like, okay, the old expanded universe, we're getting rid of it. We're going to start over. Now everything's going to be canonized. And that was the first step. But now they're actually really tightening that up, and they're starting to align everything so it all makes sense. And for that, I mean, as long as they continue this, I think that that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think with them kind of like expanding upon a lot of stuff with Palpatine, and then also kind of like the fact that they're at different points, the Jedi and Sith are kind of trying to reinvent themselves in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
They realize that there's some failures in the old, as far as the way they used to do things versus how things are, and they're like, look, I don't agree with that anymore. I think it needs to go this way. So it's really interesting, like I said, going forward post Return of the Jedi, to see what Luke was trying to do with the new Jedi Order, to see what the Sith were trying to do, what Palpatine kind of wanted. That makes the storyline a little bit more fascinating.
Well, I'll tell you, I just found this out today. I can't remember the name of the book, but I was looking through and I saw that there's a book that's going to be released. I don't know when. I would assume this year. But it's a book basically that talks about how the Jedi Council pretty much came up with what they're doing at the beginning, I guess, we see them in the Phantom Menace, right? Because
Mhm.
obviously the High Republic version, it was a lot looser, there was more freedom. People could sort of use the Force anyway. I mean, they even brought in the dark side a little bit. Nobody really had a problem with that. It's just kind of like, all right, maybe you need to slow down. It's almost like how people approach, their friends with alcohol. Like, yeah, you had a couple of drinks, man. Maybe you need to stop right now. You got to drive home. And that's basically what the Jedi of the High Republic would do for the dark side of the Force. It's like, yeah, all right, you amplified your powers a little bit to win that battle. Now maybe you need to slow down a little. So I'm really curious because I think that that's going to come into play. I'm sure that they've talked to the authors about this and said, look, this is where we're going with the animated shows, with the movies, things like that. So maybe we're finally going to get some answers that are good about why Yoda restructured the Jedi Council more the way we see it in the Phantom Menace, a little bit more dogmatic, a little bit more strict, more narrow, because remember, we had talked about this before. We said, look, something must have happened between the High Republic and this, and who knows, maybe that answer comes from the Acolyte, because that's at the tail end of the High Republic, so maybe we see that.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, now, I remember bringing this up to you years ago. We were just having a general conversation about, it wasn't even Star Wars, but, I think you were telling me that years ago, people could actually drink alcohol and drive, and it wasn't illegal.
Mm-hmm.
But then it got to the point where you start seeing more fatalities, more people start becoming more reckless with things. And so then they had to institute, like, okay, now we have to, because you can't control yourselves on your own, we have to now step in because you're causing more harm than you are good.
Well,
I
a
mean, if
little
you wanted to,
addendum.
Mhm.
There's an addendum to that too, because even when they established that rule, the blood alcohol level or whatever, like the
Yeah,
what do you
to
call
declare
it?
you drunk was a lot higher.
Yeah, right. It was a
The
little bit. It was higher. Yeah, it was higher. And
Yeah,
then what happened is it steadily lowered, and yeah, they finally got to a
now
sweet
it's like
spot to
point oh
where.
eight or something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So
And
I mean,
basically,
it
you can only
was.
have mouthwash, and that's
Yeah,
about it.
right. Exactly. It's like, well, I mean, with the NyQuil, did you fill the cup all the way, or was it halfway or whatever? Exactly.
Right.
But I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
but I think that's kind of basically what happens. I think probably what happens is that you have people, you give people free reign, and you just hope that the people just are responsible. But then, of
right.
course, people start thinking like, well, why? Who are you to say I can't use that? And now you start have to now put in things because people can't control themselves, unfortunately. So you have to put in laws, rules, and guidelines in order for people to keep people in line. Otherwise, you're going to have chaos, unfortunately. And I think that's kind of probably what happened.
Well, and not only that, but I think that really is, and this is true with just about any law, right? You have to make it for the lowest common denominator. Any set of rules, basically, because you're always going to get the guy who's going to be like, look, I could do whatever and I'm fine, but
Hmm.
you can't do that. You basically have to set it. They do this actually. I found out it's funny. It was when I went to the emergency room once, and they're like, okay, well, just go ahead and take like 4 Advil or something, like 3 times a day. And I'm like, dude, like the instructions basically say don't exceed 6. You're telling me to take like 12. And so the ER doc was like, well, all right, not really supposed to put this out there, but, and here I am on a live show.
Right. Let's see.
Hey, but it's
Well,
not,
Eric
look,
said,
we're not Mr. Beast or something, right? We don't have like millions of viewers. I mean,
not only
but
that, but we're not also not medical professionals.
yeah,
So
we're not medical. Yeah, and I should do this, right? Because all YouTubers will do this, like at their, this is not medical advice, so talk to your
yes.
doctor before taking any kind of medication. But the ER doc basically said, look, the human body can actually easily tolerate like 1,600 milligrams or something. But the reason why they have to cap it, down to like 600 or 800 is because you have to go for what's safe for everybody, no matter their health condition. And so that's why they have that maximum dosage thing on the bottle, don't exceed 6 tablets in a 24-hour period or something. Yes, welcome to Head, a medical podcast.
This is the
right
Dr. House
right
portion of the.
So and Friday's show will basically be about the science of the Bacta tank.
Well, I just did a show with the Michigan Pharmaceutical Association, so I can.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I've had to do a few medical things, so yeah, we can always feature that. All right, well, this actually goes into this line of discussion though, and this is where we get to tie in the Mandalorian a little bit, because number 3 is, why do their experiments need Grogu?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very good question too, because where is Omega now?
Right. So Moff Gideon needed Grogu to create his own sensitive clones, but not for the same reasons that Palpatine needed Omega. Grogu's blood contained the midichlorians necessary to replicate force sensitivity, as confirmed in the Bad Batch. So Gideon's enforcers are willing to kill Grogu. Palpatine, however, is trying to create a clone of himself, meaning Hemlock must learn to duplicate midichlorians. Since the Empire cannot do so, Palpatine needs a blood sample to survive a midichlorian transfer, who was a donor, while Omega is intended as a host.
So in a way, it's almost like Palpatine is trying to do to Omega what he was trying to do to Rey, his inhabitor. But what's interesting about that, though, is that by the time we get to Rey's situation, it was like, I don't know, maybe it was because she was his granddaughter, or grand clone, or whatever you want to call it. Maybe because remember, she actually had to kill him in order for him to embody the thing or something. So I wonder if it's a similar situation, if he actually has to die. I mean, obviously, that's coming at the end of Return of the Jedi. So maybe he's just trying to put all this stuff in place so that if he does die, he can just zip on into whatever the host is.
Yeah, I mean, it because and I think the catch is, if you recall in the Rise of Skywalker, and it's kind of funny because I wonder if this was the same ploy, because if you recall, all right, in Return of the Jedi, Palpatine says to Luke, "Strike me down with all your hatred, and your journey towards the dark side will be complete."
Mm-hmm.
Was he looking to use Luke? Because technically, Luke is the grandson of the Force.
Yeah, I don't know. Because I mean, look.
So that could have been the perfect way for him to, because see, once Luke is already tapping into the dark side anyway, that's why he kept saying, like, "I can feel your anger." He's like, strike me down with it. But he said the very same exact words to Rey. If you recall,
but here's the difference.
Skywalker.
There's two differences. There's the out of universe difference. I'll get that out of the way first. Lucas's vision for why Palpatine was saying that was because he saw that Luke would be a more powerful apprentice than Vader. So I think when he was talking about striking him down, it was almost the same way that he was encouraging Anakin during the duel with Dooku, right? It was kind of like, I want you to use your hatred and anger. I want you to strike me down because of everything I've done to your friends, all this other stuff. That's what he was talking about with the dark side will be complete. But now going back to in-universe, since we have the sequel trilogy and all this other stuff, I think the big distinction there is Palpatine was trying to resurrect himself. He was just basically hanging on a hook because he wasn't fully reanimated, right? So he literally did need his spirit to go into a healthy body. Whereas in, earlier, I think what he was doing especially where Omega and all this stuff is concerned. I think the whole idea is like, look, I just need to get a host or somebody ready. So if I do die, I can just, fly into this person or whatever. Or maybe he's using her and her, or would use her blood in order to create these like bodies, which of course that would align nicely with the expanded universe, because that's really what it was. It was a bunch of like Palpatine clone bodies.
Yeah. I
I
don't
mean,
know. It's kind of interesting. I mean, it's kind of because I could, I can see like, okay, because now you have more questions about Ray though, because he tried to create more of himself. That's how we got Snoke and all like Freddy Kruegerish, you know. So it's like, how did Ray come out so perfect? She was fine. Actually hot. So it's like
she's female. In Kathleen Kennedy's Star Wars universe, it's like, I mean,
yeah. Well,
I know,
you're joking, but that might actually be, but there may be some truth to that because of Omega.
Maybe.
Because maybe that was the problem. It was the fact that, okay, he kept trying to recreate it with males, and maybe that was the problem.
Well, somebody
figured out that he needed a female.
Somebody online basically was like, well, not only that, but if you look, they both have accents. That's what somebody pointed out online. Exactly. They're like, Ray's probably like some distant clone of Omega or something.
Yep.
I don't know. We'll have to see where they go, because they could go in a few different directions with this. I mean, with the clones, the idea was Palpatine had a bunch of them ready to go. This is expanded universe stuff. He had a bunch of Palpatine shells, essentially, because in the expanded universe, what happened was he did jump into one of his clones. That clone got destroyed. He jumped into another one. And then, of course, they ended up just destroying the whole thing, so he couldn't keep doing this. But that was his plan. He would always have these clone shells or whatever ready to go, so he could just inhabit them once the other one expired. So it's really interesting. But speaking of his clone stuff, now we bring Thrawn into the mix a little bit, because we find out, number 2, that Thrawn's return ends up being a distraction for Palpatine and his experiments, and this now is tying in the whole storyline that started in The Mandalorian and basically is continued in the Ahsoka series, where you have Thrawn now coming back to the core worlds, and it's going to be interesting to see where that all leads and how that's going to be handled, particularly since you have all this setup going. Because remember, Palpatine is still technically dead at this point. At least we think. I mean, it sounds like from the way that he was talking to Pride, the way that he was talking to Kylo, it was almost like he had that same disembodied spirit, like he could just talk to them, even though he wasn't, it's almost like a Force ghost kind of thing, but just without form, right? And, of course, once he had a body or whatever, now he can actually bring people to him or whatever. But that's what people are thinking. It's very similar to Exar Kun in the expanded universe as well, when he was inhabiting or haunting, depending on how you look at it, the old Yavin 4 base. And when Luke went and tried to start training people there, weird things were happening. It was actually a really good book. I can't remember which one it was in. Might have even been part of the story of the Thrawn trilogy. I'm not sure. Like I said, it's been a long time since I've read those books, but it was interesting because he ended up trying to inhabit Luke and, turn him to the dark side. And it was a really cool story arc. And that sounds like what they're setting up here.
Yeah. So essentially, it says, now that Project Necromancer is confirmed as Palpatine's cloning project, it's clear that Thrawn's coming invasion of the New Republic is merely a distraction. Captain Paleon told the Imperial Shadow Council that Thrawn's return would herald in the reemergence of our military and provide Commandant Hux enough time to deliver on Project Necromancer. While Thrawn is sure to lead a devastating campaign against the New Republic, the primary objective is to rally those loyal to the Empire and bring and bring back the Emperor, which would eventually pay off in the Star Wars sequel trilogy. So at the closer towards the tail end of season 3 of Mandalorian, when we see Gideon go into that room, and then he's in that it's almost like a weird tribunal type
Yep.
situation where that's where that conversation is being had.
Right. And again, that's where it's all tying in, because it almost, I mean, it's a very strange concept, but it almost sounds like Lucasfilm has a cohesive plan now, because a lot of the things that they're setting up and a lot of the things that they're bringing out seem thought out. They seem very deliberate. It doesn't seem like they're just, kicking out all these storylines, because you would have had massive contradictions by now. But we haven't, and that's a good sign. And so I think that that's what's happening. Now, I still don't understand the zombie stormtrooper thing yet, though. Like, is that a failed, like, okay, they tried to do some stuff as like testing this whole necromancer program, and things went horribly wrong? Because remember, they were actually bringing the clones in, taking their blood, trying to see if anybody had the pure midichlorians or the pure blood or something that they could use. And then they also were at least hinting that they might be doing other experiments or possibly disposals. I mean, we don't know yet, because obviously these are questions that are going to be answered as season 3 of The Bad Batch continues. But it's interesting to speculate.
Yeah, definitely. That it's going to be it's an interesting thing to see how all this kind of factors in, because you have different players at the table. You have Gideon, who kind of has one um, way of kind of trying to use, the whole midichlorian thing. Then you got Thrawn, who's loyal to the Emperor. He's trying to do his thing, and then of course you still have the Emperor, who's has his whole master plan. So it's going to be interesting to see how people on the same side kind of are they playing together, or is maybe one person is kind of like, all right, you guys can do that. I have my own agenda.
Well, that's it. That's what I'm wondering. I'm wondering what's going on, because it seems to me like in a lot of cases, they don't always I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it doesn't seem like they all are working together on purpose. It just seems like each one, like you said, has their own agenda. There doesn't seem to be a lot of cohesion, although the net effect may be that they might end up aligning, but we don't know right now. Is this some master grand plan and they're just all working different elements of it? Or, like you said, are they just all kind of working separately but towards a somewhat loosely common goal?
Yeah, that's the
Yeah, it's going to be the $1 million.
That's the big question. Yeah.
Okay. So now, of course, we alluded to it a little bit ago, but now, of course, the number one thing that we got to talk about is Palpatine's failed experiments explain the need for Rey. And this would actually probably go a long way in calming some of the more hardcore fans that hate the whole Mary Sue aspect of Rey and maybe feel that she's a little bit two-dimensional and
too powerful.
Too powerful. That goes along with the Mary Sue thing, or maybe not even too powerful. Maybe it just happened too quickly or whatever. They could really do something. And remember, we basically said that they're going to use these animated shows and then, of course, the live action series to softly reboot the sequel trilogy. And I believe that's what they're doing. Not so much a reboot as in, okay, the sequel trilogy is now like a world between worlds option, and now we're going to tell you what really happened. I don't think it's going to be like that. I think it's going to be more like what they're going to do is they're going to start to explain things, shape things, so that when you go back and you look at the sequel trilogy, you have all this additional context that you didn't have because they're working tremendously on trying to figure something out that'll make sense. It's basically like retrofitting the thing.
Yeah. Palpatine, his desire to possess Rey is more apparent after the Bad Batch as to why his clones failed. Without a successful M-count replication, Palpatine needs a host who can handle a midichlorian transfer. And his decaying state in The Rise of Skywalker implies that the Empire failed to capture Omega. His only remaining option is to transfer his spirit into another Force sensitive, so Rey would be the most likely to have high enough midichlorians to handle Palpatine's power. But the remaining episodes of The Bad Batch Season 3 may reveal even more secrets about Palpatine's resurrection.
Yeah, and remember, we only have the first 3 episodes of The Bad Batch, and look at how much stuff this has revealed. I mean, it's just revealed a tremendous amount of stuff. But some of it is speculative. And what Screenrant was trying to do was like, okay, we have a little bit more light shed on this time period and things that also reflect on events of the sequel trilogy. And even things also that are bringing up concepts from the prequels as well. So there is a little bit of a fill in the blank thing going on here. But again, you know, we don't have the entire season. I mean, I think I read that this is going to be 15 episodes, not 16. And it really makes me wonder, because if you think about it, the other 2 were 16. But with 15, you can have 5 trilogy episodes. So it really makes me wonder. I mean, I don't think that they're not going to release them in 3s, obviously. But I think what's going to happen is you might have a situation where, okay, the first 3 episodes were a little story arc, and maybe episodes 4, 5, and 6 are going to be another one, 7, 8, 9, and so on. So it'll be really interesting to see if that's the case. But I don't know. I think there's still a lot more that they're going to have to fill in if they want to try to tackle making the sequel trilogy make sense. But I mean, I'm willing to check it out. I mean, good luck. Because again, the thing that was so comical watching The Rise of Skywalker too is, when they did their whole little dyad thing, and then, Palpatine sort of tapped into that, and then just like one little power blast, and he was like 80%, whole again. He was like, whoa. I actually didn't expect this.
Yeah, this is kind of cool.
It's like, oh, you're a dyad.
And he basically destroyed himself. So Rey didn't even have to do it. He destroyed his own, himself. So
yeah, I know. It's just
like
going to be.
He would have learned to let that go,
or at least put in the problem. Here's the thing that I find funny about, especially when you look at the sequel trilogy and you think about all this stuff, and in light of what we're learning, even in the Bad Batch now, as part of his plan. So he had this whole 30 years, right? He's like this 30-year plan. He's methodically and meticulously carrying this thing out. And then right at the home stretch, that's when he decides to rush everything. It's almost like, because if you think about it, it's like what he's accomplishing in 30 years, then what he ends up doing essentially in the Rise of Skywalker movie. It just seemed very accelerated to me.
Well, I think it was just, but I think it may be a sense of urgency because he felt like he was dying faster.
That could be. Yeah, he was decaying pretty bad. I mean,
because you look at him, man, his lips were blue and black, and I mean, dude, his eyes, he didn't even have pupils anymore. Like, we're used to seeing the glowing red eyes of his. Like, he didn't have any of that. It was just white. Like, I mean, he was practically almost a corpse. Yeah, and I think that's when he realized, like, okay, I have to act now. Well, I have basically Rey right here. Like, And I think that's why he told Kylo, look, I'll give you everything you want. Just bring me this chick, because I'm almost out of here, dude. Like, you got one job.
So, all comes down.
Yeah, man, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. I'm actually, once we've tackled this list and Screenrant brought all this stuff up, it really makes me even more eager to see the remaining episodes of this season of The Bad Batch.
Yeah. It was so funny because I never thought we needed the show.
No, I know. Well, that's the way we feel about a lot of those shows that we like. I mean, if you think about it, like Rebels, we're like, I don't know. Even after the first episode, we're like, well, all right, we'll give it a little bit of a shot. I don't know if I'm really that into it, though. Real quick, let me give the results of some of these polls. It's funny, I've been talking to some of the people. It never ceases to amaze me, but it's also the reason why I love doing this, where you actually get to see a lot of people's varying points of view on things. Like, for instance, there was one or two people that were actually heavily disagreeing with us that episode 2 was filler of The Bad Batch. Like, they made some very, very strong cases about why it wasn't filler at all. Of course, I was trying to remind them, saying, look, we didn't say it was totally filler. We just said when you compare it, I mean, I look at it, I even said this, I look at it more like a bridge between the stories of 1 and 3. But, you know, it's really funny. Okay. Oh, look at this. So we got a ton of votes, like more than anything that we've done. You know, usually we'll get like 20, 30 votes on any polls we do. This is kind of funny because it's very Star Wars, but we got 66 votes on this poll so far. And of course, it was which Bad Batch Season 3 premiere episode was your favorite. Now, for a long time, The Shadows of Tantus, which was episode 3, that just killed it. It was like 100%. And then episode 2 had a little bit, but now it's basically still 85% episode 3, Shadows of Tantus. We have 9% for Paths Unknown, which was episode 2, and 6% for Confined, which is episode 1, which that surprises me a little bit because I actually thought that was a pretty strong, I thought that was a pretty strong episode, but that's why it's really cool to see these things. So, we're going to keep putting up these polls and we're going to keep, having you guys vote because some of the stuff gives us direction on maybe where to take the show, see what you guys are into, what you're not so into. Some of it'll be stuff like that, like, maybe put up a poll now about some of the stuff we talked about today. So, be sure to check that out. All right. And again, this Friday, as every Friday, we're going to be doing the review of The Bad Batch. So episode 4 comes out Wednesday. And Friday, we're going to be doing a live review, 11 o'clock. Again, that's too late for some of you guys, or you're just like, yeah, no. It's going to be available to watch after the fact, of course. But if you can make it live, that would be great because we love the interaction. So, I don't know. I think that's, like you said, we're just going to have to wait and see as each of these episodes progress how much more of this story we're going to get because this is more exciting. If you compare this to season 1 and 2 of The Bad Batch, that was cool because you got a little bit of world building. You got a little bit of, here's what's going on directly after episode 3. Because most of the stuff takes place closer to episode 4. The Bad Batch was the first series that took place like as Order 66 was happening and beyond. But this season is actually putting us deep into a lot of things that affect the canon all the way beyond the sequel trilogy even. So, exciting stuff. So again, if you guys haven't had a chance to do so yet, we always appreciate it if you guys hit that like button, give us that thumbs up, and of course subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. So we'll see you guys pretty much Friday night at 11 o'clock. If anything changes, of course, we'll let you know. And just keep an eye on the community tab for any communications between now and then. So with that, I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.